We do all kinds of things here at Word in Your Ear.
Videocasts like this.
Podcasts like this.
Crowdcast events with famous authors.
Live quizzes.
And we can guarantee to make your next birthday one you'll never forget.
There's only one way to guarantee getting all of this, to getting it before anybody else, and that's to sign on to be a supporter on Patreon.
Full details at this address.
Word in Your Attic, a Zoom with a view.
Well, never let it be said that we don't run a broad church here on Word in Your Attic, because our previous guest was the man who brought us the Wombling hits, where we're talking about Mike Batt, and now we switch without blinking at all to historian of the ancient world and best-selling author. We're delighted to welcome Tom Holland. Tom, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thanks very much for having me.
Where are you, Tom? Whereabouts are you? Is it in London?
Yeah, it's Brixton in London.
Fantastic.
Right.
Loving the hat in the background there.
Thanks very much. That's been to a few desert locations, but not at the moment, alas.
So how have you been passing your time?
In lockdown? Well,
Yeah.
I've just been working, to be honest. It doesn't really affect me because I write at home, so it hasn't really altered things. And the only thing that I do is go for incredibly long walks around London.
Which parts then? Obviously from Brixton, but I mean, which bits are you exploring?
We've been all over the place. The first one we did was on Easter Day, and we went to Westminster Bridge to do a 28 days after walk, and it was we got there kind of 6 o'clock, so there was no traffic at all, and you could really imagine that there were toppled double-deckers in Whitehall and zombies roaming the city. And then we did another one where we, in The War of the Worlds, the narrator comes back to London after it's been taken over by the Martians, and he describes the route all the way up to Regent's Park, where the aliens have been killed by bacteria. And we followed it all the way through. And again, it was kind of this empty city. It was just amazing. And then since then, we've been following the lost rivers of London, so the Fleet and the Tyburn and the Effra and all those kind of things. And we just, the most recent one was on my birthday on the 5th of January. We went and followed the Black Ditch, which is a river so obscure that people can't even remember the name. They just remember it as a sewer.
Where is it, or was it?
It runs from Stepney down to Limehouse. And it just gets you to kind of see parts of the city that you wouldn't otherwise see, and it gives a purpose to where you're going. So that's what I've been doing. That's been my idea, but nothing else really.
So that's your birthday treat.
That was
what would you like to do today? I'd like to go and follow the line of the Black Ditch, darling.
I'd like to imagine where zombies were, or whatever. That's right. Yeah.
I know how to show people a good time, I can tell you.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, Tom, you haven't got a lot of your kind of teenage clutter because, as you say, it's at your parents' house. But there's a certain amount of it, no doubt, that you remember fondly. What we traditionally ask people on these podcasts, can you remember the music playing machinery that was in your home when you were a child?
I can, because it was incredibly distinctive. It was a kind of great brown square kind of, it wasn't even a gramophone. It was kind of like a massive great box, and it had a nicotine yellow kind of, all the plastic work. And I don't know when it kind of looked as if it was made in 1860 or something. It was just unbelievable. I don't know where it had come from. And that the sound was terrible, absolutely terrible. And then I remember, it must have been my, 8th or 9th birthday. I got an actual stereo with headphones. And I remember being so overwhelmed by the sound that I just played all the records over and over again. I just couldn't believe it. I guess it's kind of like upgrading to high definition television or something like that. But even more kind of overwhelmed, because I cannot tell you how terrible this thing was, this kind of box.
Can you remember what was playing on it? Were these your parents' records, presumably, in the early days?
My parents were incredibly unmusical. They had almost no records at all. And so my brother and I, like so many others, discovered music basically through the Beatles. And weirdly, it was a book from the library that we got, the local library, that was called The Mersey Beat, which was a collection of the Mersey Beat was the the music sheet in Liverpool. And it collected it all and told the stories through that, which was such an odd way to get into the Beatles.
Oh, really?
So, and so we saved up our pocket money to go and get these records that were being mentioned in the Mersey Beat, and that's how we started. And I write history now, and I realise that with music, as with so much else, I always seem to be kind of late to things. I'm always interested in things that happened, before the present. And I guess really kind of the feeling I had with music over and over again was that I was always jealous of stuff that had been going on just before I discovered it. So I'm not a kind of person who's ahead of trends. I'm always about a decade behind.
Well, we keep coming back upon this. Of course, these chats, and the classic case is Pete Perfides, who only discovered that there was such a group as the Beatles after John Lennon died. It was like, oh, John Lennon.
He said, was he in the band with the bloke from Wings? That's incredible. That must have been great. He said, that must have been a brilliant group. I must go and find some of their records.
Oh, no, I knew. I was the most devastating. I mean, it was my first experience of bereavement, I suppose. I never, John Lennon felt such a part of my life. I couldn't believe that the news when it got told, in a bubble, because the fact that he was coming out of retirement. And it was so exciting. It kind of, it was like, as if, Julius Caesar had come back to life. Suddenly there was John Lennon on the radio. And then it was just devastating, completely devastating.
It was always rather sad that there were those rather mediocre reviews of the new album. And then after he died, everyone reassessed it and said it was a work of absolutely unparalleled genius,
Yeah.
But you must be, I think you're about the same age as Pete Perfides. When were you born? Late 60s, was it?
I was born in 1968, I think on the day that Magical Mystery Tour was released.
Oh, wow.
Brilliant. That's good. That's a historian for you.
Obviously, not that I knew it at the time.
Yeah.
No. So you and your brother went around buying Beatles records after the Beatles had broken up. Well, yeah, clearly.
Yeah, so my parents didn't have any. I mean, it's hard to put into words just how unmusical they were and how lacking interest in it. So, yeah, and I think, weirdly, looking back at it, because we started with Mersey Beat, so even before the Beatles had recorded any of their records, it's kind of like we followed their career as someone would have done if they were following it in real time.
Fantastic.
So we moved through the records chronologically, and we had the Red and the Blue albums, and we were slightly intimidated by the Blue album because we found the beards quite intimidating, I think.
Oh, right.
And so we were and basically facial hair. The facial hair, we didn't like the facial hair, I remember. So to begin with, we were very much into the Red album period. So we kind of moved in a gingerly manner up towards Revolver. And then we kind of got stuck there. And then we took the leap and bought Sgt. Pepper. And again, it was a bit like moving from this kind of brown square gramophone thing to a proper stereo. Suddenly to hear Sgt. Pepper, I remember it being a kind of an amazing experience. And then reading, in books about people's reaction to Sgt. Pepper, I realized I was exactly replicating it. So
how old would you have been at the time then when you were listening to it?
I think, 9 or 10.
Amazing. That's fascinating.
9 or 10. And the weird thing was that the 60s then seemed an unimaginable distance. So that would have been 1978, 77, 78. The 60s seemed unimaginably removed, like it was a different age. And of course, now I look back and I think, actually, it was no distance at all. We were just a few years away from it.
Were you listening to the things that were going on? That was 1978. Were you also listening to what was happening in 1978, as it were, simultaneously? Or had you gone back through this wormhole in time?
Well, I remember we had my mother's best friend who lived in Cheshire, and we went up there, and her sons were kind of 4 or 5 years older than us, and they were into the kind of undertones and Stiff Little Fingers and all that kind of stuff. And they had NME. And this was unknown territory to me. And that was really eye-opening. And again, I felt a bit intimidated by it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I became a kind of huge fan of the undertones as a result of that. and actually talking about doing walks, one of the kind of amazing things that that happened recently was that because I've been walking all these rivers, it turns out that Feargal Sharkey is a huge enthusiast for rivers.
In charge of the rivers.
Environmental, that's right, rivers, yeah.
Yeah, so we got in touch, and we walked along this chalk stream called the Fur, which runs through St Albans. And it's about 18 miles. We walked 18 miles with Feargal Sharkey, and this is one of the oddest experiences of my life, and one of the most brilliant experiences of my life. I mean, he is a man of infinite energy. He just did not stop walking. He does not stop talking. He's the most amazing companion. And yet, because if you ever mention an Undertone song or the lyrics of any song that he's ever written, he'll find you on the spot. I couldn't actually talk to him about it.
I know, you're desperate to talk about My Perfect Cousin, and all he wants to talk about is chalk streams.
Yeah, I was desperate. Well, I was very happy to talk about chalk streams, and so the focus was kept on chalk streams. But I was kind of imagining, if I met, it's like meeting Paul McCartney and you're allowed to talk about vegetarianism or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that would be.
It'd be very.
Yes, he's really strict about that, isn't he? He's completely reinvented himself. That past doesn't really exist.
Yeah, very. Yeah. Yeah,
because he's a rare case of a rock star who's gone on to do something kind of useful with his life.
Yeah,
it's amazing,
later
man.
on.
I mean, he basically sorted out the kind of Spotify issue for streaming and all
he
was.
I mean,
amazing guy, really amazing guy.
Very, very energetic, extraordinary. Going back to your point about the Beatles, I wondered if you, as a historian, had a view on this. That very often somebody points out it's 50 years since Neil Young recorded Harvest or whatever, and I always automatically go, okay, 50 years from Neil Young recording Harvest takes you to 1922.
Yeah. Yeah,
that just seems extraordinary. Whereas records always seem as if they happened the week before last, kind of thing.
I feel that really strongly. I mean, I said about how it gradually dawned on me that when I was a child and discovering the Beatles, the 60s weren't actually that far removed from me. But what I now realise looking back is that the 60s in turn were, almost immediate. I mean, they were so close to the end of the Second World War. And all the violence and the horror of that. I mean, in your book about the Glastonbury, there's a submarine commander who was involved in it, who was...
God, yes. I've forgotten.
I remember, that the guy who helped set up the Glastonbury Festival had got some military award for shooting U-boats or something. And it was kind of eye-opening stuff. And So looking at the Beatles story, there's a paradigmatic example of that. Famously, the end of conscription happened just before the band got, started releasing their albums. And if John Lennon had been, sent off to join the army, the Beatles would never have happened.
Absolutely, that whole generation would never have happened at all.
Yeah, because there was all those, John Peel was had to do. Service, so because I think he was 2 years older.
And the sense you get with all those bands that all those men in those bands are kind of singing their heads off with relief that they're not having their hair cut and having to do square bashing. And you also realise that the uniforms on Sgt. Pepper are kind of much more subversive than probably seems apparent now. It's and the talk
that's a
of
good
peace
point.
And love and everything exists in the context of all those
Stars and Stripes, and yes,
and which Liverpool was so devastated. They're living among all this terrible bomb damage, and then the first place they go, they go past the war graves at Arnhem when they're in the van going to Hamburg, and then in Hamburg, all the people in the bars and things and the clubs are kind of ex-Nazis because it's the only place that they can get the jobs. So the Beatles, the legacy of the war is right in their face. And the context that then provides for all the talk about, love and peace and stuff, and John Lennon changing Winston to owner. I mean, it's kind of, I understand that now in a way that I didn't, obviously, when I was that much younger. The relationship of the 60s to the war is kind of, seems to me a really, really interesting topic.
Yeah. Do you think there are certain decades, whether it's in pop music or history or whatever, where a lot happens, and then other decades where not so much happens, or is that just an illusion?
Well, I reckon, and this may sound kind of slightly over the top, but I don't think it is. I reckon the 1960s were as significant a decade for broad Western culture as the first decade of the Reformation back in the 16th century. I think it has set everything on a new course. And I think the music was a crucial part of it. So as in the Reformation, the hymns were a vital way in which the kind of Protestant ideas could transmit. I think in exactly the same way, the music of the 60s was articulating a new understanding of values that nevertheless was drawing on a kind of, this incredible deep reservoir of ideas and values and principles, but completely recalibrating them. And that's why it kind of fuses with things like the civil rights movement, all that kind of stuff. And I think that basically everything that's happened since the 1960s is just the kind of ripple effects. It's the aftershocks, it's the echoes of that decade. And I think you could say that that's true of the music, but I think it's also true of so much else as well, the values, the politics, everything.
Now, in your most recent or recently published book, Dominion, which is it's about how the ideas of Christianity still have underpin so much of what everybody thinks about the world today. You write about the Beatles and love and where that fits in with it. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, it's a kind of an enormously ambitious book because it covers 2,500 years of history.
Yeah.
And so by the time I was kind of reaching the modern age, I basically had to put in stuff that I was interested in because that was the kind of easiest way to get across, the sweep of the centuries and the decades. So I have a chapter on the Beatles, and more generally on the civil rights movement and on the impact that music in America had on the civil rights movement. Because so music from the black churches becoming, black music in America. And I think that, saying that the 60s is this kind of period of convulsive change comparable to the Reformation, I think what happens in the 60s is that fundamental Christian ideas like the primacy of love. So at the beginning of the book, I quote St. Augustine, who says, "Do as you will and love." And basically, that's the kind of hippie message. Do what you want, let it hang out, love people. All you need is love. That's basically the message. But of course, love in 1967, in the summer of love, comes to have a very different signification because it does mean, in the kind of the Christian sense, love everyone. Love is what makes the world go round, all that kind of stuff. But it also has a much more kind of sexualized dimension as well. And basically, I think that what happens in the 60s is that fundamental Christian ideas get taken and turned and kind of become they come to seem antithetical to Christianity. And one of the ways in which that's expressed is that Christianity is, for very Christian reasons, Christianity gets rejected. Christianity is seen as being kind of too powerful, too overwhelming. And I think the Beatles are very, very significant for the way that they become really the first the people in popular culture to express that. So it's not just John Lennon saying that the Beatles are bigger than Jesus. It's also, I didn't get this in the book and I really wanted to, but I just didn't have space. It's the way that George Harrison moves to Hinduism and to kind of an interest in Eastern religions. But he's taking fundamentally Christian ideas and kind of reconfiguring them and putting a kind of an Indian spin on them. But he's doing that because he sees the kind of Christian inheritance as dull and boring and something to be rejected and something oppressive. And My Sweet Lord is really the perfect illustration of that you go from Hallelujah to Hare Krishna. But, again, you wrote about it in your wonderful book, the concert for Bangladesh. The concert for Bangladesh is an incredibly kind of Christian thing. The idea that you have to raise money to help people out in famine. And that then, of course, feeds into Band Aid and Live Aid and that idea that music should kind of do good, that you should help people, in need, which, of course, is a kind of a reversal of the kind of more the primal idea that actually rock and roll is all about having fun and sex and
but it was only a development of the 1960s thing about rock and roll being able to change the world and having a political dimension. The Bob Dylan thing was a political dimension, wasn't it? So it was really just an extension of that.
Yeah, except I think that the idea that it's just about fun is actually one of the most radical things. So I think actually, girls screaming their tits off at the Beatles is actually incredible. I mean, it's an amazing, amazing thing because it's simply about pleasure, about the joy of the moment, about the kind of the ecstasy of the moment. And that is something that's kind of actually, I think, in the context of the culture as it existed previously, the sense of mass pleasure, mass enjoyment is quite a kind of novel thing. And that is something that, again, that runs through popular music. So I guess, literally people taking ecstasy to experience ecstasy. And you get these kind of peaks of pure hedonism and then they plunge down again. And the whole way through, in the background, there is this kind of nagging idea that, well, actually, maybe we shouldn't just be having fun. Maybe we should be, articulating political messages or raising money for people in need or whatever. And that, I think, is the kind of Christian inheritance that just having fun, humans are not here just to have fun. We have moral responsibilities. We have to help the poor. We have to help the sick, whatever. So I think that's what I mean in the sense that it's kind of like a new Reformation. It's taking Christian principles, Christian ideas, and recalibrating them.
Oh, very interesting. Very interesting. Hey, what I always think is amazing about George Harrison is that he was the youngest one of them, wasn't he? And so, when he was writing all those songs about mortality, and he was what? He was 28 or something like this, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Well, they'd lived a lifetime in just 7 or 8 years, hadn't they? He's the one who famously said it's all right for everybody else. Everybody else gave their money and their screams. The Beatles gave their nervous
systems. That's right. Yeah.
You could see that on his face, that he was kind of worried about them. He just carried this great anxiety around with him. It was extraordinary.
And it wasn't a fad. He developed that interest in Eastern religion and Eastern music. And you kind of thought that was going to be a kind of pop music thing where 6 months later he moved on to something else. But it was with him all his life. I really, really admired him for that.
Yeah, and I think in his solo career, perhaps even in the Beatles as well, there's this constant sense that actually writing great music that you just enjoy as great music is somehow wrong. That it has to kind of serve a broader purpose. Yeah. And I think he would have been much more successful and probably much happier if he hadn't kind of carried that round. And he you can take the boy out of Catholicism, but you can't take the Catholicism out of the boy.
No, that's a really interesting point. That is, I did an interview with Eric Clapton years ago, and he'd just come back from a tour of Japan with George Harrison. Do you remember when Clapton played in George Harrison's band? This would be I don't know when this was, late 80s, 90s.
Is that not the Travelling Wilburys?
No, it will be before that. I would imagine. It's George. He toured Japan. I don't think he toured anywhere else. He toured Japan, and he had a band probably with Ray Cooper and the usual suspects.
Yes.
And Eric Clapton was in the group. They made a live album, I think. And I said, "How was it?" He said, "Oh, I just wish he'd relax and enjoy it a bit more."
Yes.
You're George Harrison, for Christ's sake, enjoy it. There aren't many people who get that privilege.
There's an incredibly awkward interview with Clapton and Harrison on that tour where they're talking about Pattie Boyd. and something and what songs were written about her, and it's so awkward.
Oh God. Oh, that would be, wouldn't it?
I could just imagine.
And yes, he looks haggard. I think it's fair to say.
Oh dear.
But it's true. He never wrote any fun-loving songs, did he? Like McCartney, he wrote songs just purely about kind of joy and happiness. And did he? I don't know. They all even write even "Don't Bother Me" and all the things he started with. That.
Oh, that's true.
They all had a kind of dimension to them.
Do you still buy records, Tom?
I don't. I've basically been Spotified.
Right.
And also, I think I kind of I I think it's undignified in a way.
What, to buy records?
No, to keep I kept abreast of music quite closely up until I had my first child, and I used to go clubbing quite a lot. And I remember my first daughter was born in late December, and there was a big kind of thing in one of the Brixton clubs for Valentine's Day, the following Valentine's Day, and I went to that and came back and then had to look after my daughter. And I thought, I can't do, I now understand why having children does kind of change you. And I kind of wanted to become a blue meanie, I guess. I wanted to I thought, well, I'm going to become a parent, I'm going to do it properly. And so basically the interest in music faded then. But the great thing about having children is that, of course, that now that they can educate me, and I'm happy to be educated in that way. But I don't keep abreast of it in the way that I did.
No. So I
think also one of the things you asked about what we're doing in lockdown, and what I found is that I'm kind of turning back to all kinds of things that over the course of my life I've particularly loved, and that I can absolutely know is kind of gold-plated brilliant. So I watched the whole of The Sopranos because I knew I knew watching that is going to be brilliant. I've been reading Dickens because I know that's going to be brilliant. And
which Dickens have you been reading? I just started Our Mutual Friend.
Just before Christmas, I read. I did a walk. I got a friend who's a big Dickens fan, and she took me around Dickens's London. She did this kind of wonderful tour, and we ended up looking at this bank on the Strand, which was the model for the bank in Tale of Two Cities. And I suddenly realized I hadn't read it since school, and hadn't particularly enjoyed it. So I read it just before Christmas and was completely blown away by it. And whether I'm older, whether it's the stress of the pandemic or anything, but I found I by the end I was in floods of tears, and I was kind of being moved by all the ssentimental stuff that as a young man I'd always been contemptuous for. And now I'm halfway through Bleak House, and all the kind of stuff of it's so good. It's so good. And basically I've returned to the Beatles in the same way. I hadn't been immersed in the Beatles at all for kind of several decades. I just had too much of them. I'd listened to them too much. But over the past year I've completely plunged back in. I've listened to them endlessly.
So any particular songs that have resonated?
Well, I mean, the obvious one, and I'm kind of ashamed to say it, but everyone must be feeling it, is Here Comes the Sun. I've kind of been playing it pretty much every day as a token of what I hope will happen. And I think that if we get to April and the pandemic's fading and the vaccinations are kicking in, the power of that is going to be so great. And we were talking about how there's never any joy in George Harrison's music. Actually, there's joy. No,
that's
in that.
true. No, there isn't that.
That is.
Yeah.
So that one,
that's true.
But also just the a lot of the early stuff actually. Simply because of that kind of raw sense of fun.
It's a joy. It's
joy. The harmonies of it, the joy of it. Listen to it, and it's kind of it buoys me up amid the gloom.
I tell you what's even more extraordinary is if you watch. Well, Mark and I were talking about the other day. There's this Peter Jackson footage of them from Let It Be, which is was released. But if you watch them in 1964 doing TV programs on recordings on YouTube, you realize that a huge amount of the pleasure you got was from watching their pleasure in doing what they did.
Yeah.
So they were hearing that noise that they made and looking at each other going, my goodness, we're doing this.
Yeah.
And I sat there at the edge
and look at the effect it's having.
Yeah. That was so exciting.
And to be honest, back when I was a child, that's why I didn't want to move on to the Blue album.
Yeah.
Because the Red album period, is they're loving being Beatles.
It's all joy.
Yeah. What could be more fun? Whereas the Blue album, they're not getting on with each other, and I didn't like the idea of them. So I could never bring myself to listen to the solo stuff until quite late. Right. And I love a lot of the solo stuff, but I found Plastic Ono Band quite a traumatic album to listen to. God is don't believe in Beatles. Quite
oh God, it's hard work. The primal scream therapy stuff.
Dr. Yarnall.
I know. Oh, it's terrible.
It's funny you should say about Here Comes the Sun. I think it's really interesting because that's now officially the Beatles' most popular song.
Is it?
Because
it's the most streamed, isn't it?
It's the most streamed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like the same thing.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised.
Because and I was talking to a friend of ours who works for Spotify, and he said the reason is it's playlist culture. So everybody makes a summer playlist. And what do you put on a summer playlist? You put Here Comes the Sun.
Yeah.
And you probably put it first.
Yeah.
Because it's the obvious, so it's one of those things that people just use in their lives.
Yeah.
But I think you're absolutely right. That,
I think it has, a particular Good Day Sunshine, of course, I'll also
yeah.
ready to play. I just think that kind of one of the odd things about this is that usually we the seasons pass us by really. I mean, kind of you're aware of them, and the year has its kind of rhythm and of stuff. But I think that we're plunged back into a pre-modern world where winter is to be feared because it's a time of plague. And actually, one of the other walks I did was I was planning to do. I'm very opposed to this plan for a tunnel at Stonehenge, and last April I was planning with my brother to do a protest walk against that from Dover to Stonehenge. So we were going to be walking through Kent, and then of course it got abandoned. And walking through Kent, in April, I was thinking a lot about Chaucer. And suddenly it came home to me that the reason that Chaucer meets up in the pub and meets up with loads of strangers and he's not social distancing, and the fact that they're going off then, is because the plague season in London has ended. And you get something of the joy of, the Canterbury Tales is all about the joy of being able to get out of your homes, to meet strangers, to meet people, to go out.
Was that just after the plague then?
Yeah.
Well, the plague is endemic. The Black Death is coming and it's hitting England in waves. And by the time Chaucer's writing the Canterbury Tales, you're not aware of the waves because it's endemic. Every winter, the plague is coming. So the coming of spring means that the plague season is ending, and that's what it's about. And I'll tell you what it reminded me of was the bit what's the song? My brain's gone. The wonderful bit where in Abbey Road, where suddenly everything's telling you, give me your money. Yeah, you never give me your money.
Slumbers?
No, you never give me your money, and it's kind of really, you never give me money, and then suddenly put your foot on the gas and wipe the tears away. And that kind of soaring
from the medley,
that soaring McCartney moment, a bit like you get in Band in the Run as well, where everything's it's downbeat, and then suddenly you're free, you've escaped from prison, or you've escaped your money worries, and that I think also I will be playing. Because to
step
get
on the
out
gas, wipe that tear away.
Step on the gas. That's it. Step on the gas, wipe that tear away. That's what I think Canterbury Tales is about. It's stepping on the gas and wiping the tears away and heading out. And that's what I will be doing. I hope when we can, when the lockdown ends and the sun comes and it's Good Day Sunshine. And I think that songs that express that sense of joy are so much more precious now than they'd been previously. And I think that actually, we've talked about George Harrison, but I think Paul McCartney is supreme for that. I think his capacity to evoke joy through a really simple melody is so transcendent. And again, something I've completely kind of been rediscovering.
Surely the whole of the Ram album being a good example of that.
Yeah, it's so good.
Phenomenal record.
So amazingly empathetic as well. I mean, when I listened to Another Day, kind of like when I was, I don't know, 10 or 11 or something, I didn't get it. And now I think it's an amazingly beautiful song, compassionate song, tender song about a girl with a dreary job in an office. I mean, how would Paul McCartney know to write that? It's an amazing song.
Yeah.
Well, you could say that about so much of his stuff. She's Leaving Home, where he imagines himself in the minds of the parents. It's astonishing.
Yeah, yes, and I think so. So that sense of empathy combined with the sense of joy is again something that I've really appreciated over the past year in a way that I hadn't before.
So, what's your how does music fit into your writing regime, or doesn't it? Do you work with music on, or can you?
I don't, because that would be too distracting. But what I do is, because I write for a general audience, but I try to make it as academically grounded as possible. I will immerse myself in very scholarly material, and then I have to put it in a way that I hope people will enjoy reading. So it's important when I come back, say, from a day in the library, that I find a way to kind of turn that very academic experience into something slightly more popular appeal. So throughout the period when I'm writing, I always have certain tracks or certain pieces of music that do that for me. So I remember the first work of history I wrote was about the fall of the Roman Republic, so the period of Julius Caesar and Pompey and Cleopatra and all that kind of stuff. And I'd be in the library reading very scholarly books, poring over all that. Then I come back, and the album that did it for me was the theme music for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And it wasn't the famous theme tune. It was the ending. I don't know if you remember it. There were two tracks in particular. There's one where the Ugly is running around the grave, and I think it's called The Lust for Gold, and it's everything that the Romans were. It's all the Romans were all about the lust for gold, and it's this kind of faintly, it's evocative of violence and heat and the Mediterranean, spaghetti westerns and everything. And it was so perfect. So whenever I needed to write about the Romans destroying Carthage or something, I'd whack that on while I made myself a cup of tea. And then there's another one, the final shootout, where the three of them, the good, the bad, and the ugly, are facing each other. And it's a kind of amazing operatic sequence where the music builds up to this thunderous conclusion. And the fall of the Republic was centered around the rivalry between three men, the first triumvirate, Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus. So when I was writing about them, I would go and put this music on and then come back, and I'd be absolutely fired up. So always I try and find something like that. But I think it's generally instrumental music and usually film music, rather than because if you're listening to, I don't know, any band that is worth listening to, they're too powerful. The voice is too powerful. The synergy between lyrics and
it's lyrics that is distracting, isn't it?
Yeah. So that's the problem. Because then you're thinking about them rather than about the subject that you want to get into. Terrible theme music. It's not terrible. Ennio Morricone is great, but that I listen to that a lot.
So what are you working on at the moment? Can you say?
Yeah, I'm doing a series of histories of the Roman Empire. I've done the one I just mentioned about the fall of the Republic, and then I did one about the first emperors, so Augustus through to Nero, which was kind of great. What's not to like about Caligula and Nero? And I'm about to start on the sequel to that, which is the heyday of the empire. So that will include Pompeii and Hadrian's Wall and things like that. But then after that, what I'd really like to do is to write a book on the 60s on the theme that we've been talking about today, about it as a kind of a new Reformation. Because I think in a sense it's only now that we've got the distance from it that we can judge it, its historical significance properly. And one of the reasons that I've been re-immersing myself in the Beatles is that I'd like to structure it around the life of the Beatles, the career of the Beatles, because the thing about them is that they are kind of, they're emblematic. They seem to be in the right place at the right time, and their career begins and ends at the right time. It's absolutely perfect, really.
Now, if you haven't got a title, you're going to have to call it The Greatest Story Ever Told, because that is the Beatles. The Beatles is the greatest story ever told.
It's interesting you say that. Yeah, because I was thinking, I do a podcast as well.
Oh yes, you do. You do. Yeah, plug the podcast.
The rest is history.
The rest is history.
Tune in. Sign up. And we did. I did an episode with Dominic Sandbrook, the friend who I do it with, who's a historian of modern Britain. He's written a lot about Beatles and the 60s and popular music and punk and new romantics in his most recent book. It was in the context of The Crown coming out. We were talking about the story of Diana, Charles and Diana, and saying, it's just an amazingly perfect story. You can't really believe it happened. The arc of it, the marriage, the failure, she dies. You wouldn't believe it if it was written in a romance.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like the modern matter of Britain, like King Arthur. It's a story that everybody knows. And then we talked about the Beatles and said the Beatles is the other modern matter of Britain because the story is so perfect. You can't believe how perfectly structured it is. And
the most perfect thing is that they split up and they never got back together again.
Yeah. That's what defines it as a story. It's got an end.
Yeah.
The Rolling Stones is not a story at all.
Yes, they
their reputation's been constantly tarnished by not very good records, and by the fact that they also physically get older, which they can't help, and I don't blame them. But the Beatles are preserved forever, aren't they? As being these, I think they were all in their 20s when they officially split up, which is astonishing.
And yet, I just read the Rob Sheffield book, which I was very ashamed not to have read before, Dreaming the Beatles, and he kind of brought home to me that I'd never really considered how amazing it was that the Beatles broke up and the two songwriters went off and for women who basically were more appealing to them than the Beatles, and the significance of Yoko and Linda in the story, because as a child they were always the baddies, boo hiss, but now I kind of think that's actually amazing that they did kind of. They did say all you need is love in the end. And I think that's part of the story as well.
Yes, that's true.
That they did live by it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of amazing, that to go off, I suppose actually that's something for the Christian story, to go off and kind of break up the band and go and monogamous married love. I mean, it's kind of really amazing.
Was it a question of loving those women? Was it a question of loving those women or disliking each other? Was it about, it was a combination of the two?
It's a bit of both, wasn't it?
I mean, the women just seemed a preferable environment.
Both,
but being in a room arguing,
I mean, I was so cross with Paul. I'm so cross with John for going on. I mean, how could they possibly have preferred Yoko or Linda to the Beatles? But now I think it's amazing.
At the time, I just remember it feeling like, oh, they've come to the end. All right, fine, they've come to the end. Because you didn't expect in 1969 or 70, you didn't expect bands to go on forever because there hadn't been any who had gone on forever.
Yeah, and the Beatles are the template, aren't they?
Yeah.
You didn't even realise that at the time, really, because there were. I mean, find a group in 1969 or 70. Find a group who've been going longer than the Beatles. The Shadows. The End.
Yeah.
You could. There wouldn't have been any other ones.
But I guess
so it's different nowadays.
But I think the fact they break up.
So I didn't feel resentful at the time. I just thought it was inevitable.
Really. But I was looking back. Back,
okay.
and so I was
you
kind
were
of,
right.
So I was kind of resentful of
I
was resentful of them because otherwise they'd still be around.
Oh, I see what you mean.
But Double Fantasy reconciled me to it because, of course, it was John and Yoko. And then, obviously, Yoko being widowed, I was reconciled to Yoko after that.
You got it. You got a piece of Yoko's work there, haven't you? Is that right?
I have. Yes, I have. So it's I bought this for my wife, who is called Sadie. So you can imagine what we talked about when we first met. I said sexy Sadie to her, and instead of slapping me, we started riffing about the Maharishi. So we met over the Beatles. So they've always been incredibly important to both of us. So I bought her this, and it's very suitable for this.
What does it say?
For this podcast, it says, "A key to open a faded memory." And it's one of 40 that Yoko made. And you open it, and there's a key in a heart.
Yeah, that's lovely.
So all you need is love. So
that's great.
Yeah,
very nice. So what's your next walk, Tom, that you got planned?
I need to think about that. I find the following the rivers, the buried rivers across London, hugely enjoyable because there's the sense of kind of a bit like ley lines. There's a kind of psychic energy hanging over them that you're discovering something lost and buried that's nevertheless still there. And you walk along the line of a river and you suddenly understand the geography of London. You see, that you're walking through a river valley. So Piccadilly is a river valley. I'd never realised that.
Well,
before.
the Strand, I didn't realise till I went on one of those walks that the Strand was called the Strand because that was
yes,
the
right
edge
next
of the
to
river.
the Thames.
It was
but
where the boats were stranded, weren't they? Up on the...
Yes, and it's really, really. You follow the Tyburn, you go all the way through Mayfair, and all those pedestrian streets in Mayfair are pedestrianised because the river is running underneath them, so you can't broaden it out. And the river comes out onto Piccadilly, and look up to Hyde Park, you look up to Piccadilly Circus, they're higher than the lowest point of Piccadilly, and that's because it's a river valley. And mind blown.
Yeah,
and so you keep getting, or the fact that King's Cross is circular is because it follows the contour of the line of the Fleet, and it's circular because it got ground out by a glacier. So that concave of King's Cross is circular because of a glacier. Again, once you realise that, you never forget it. So the sense of the geography, the sense of the history of it, I really, really enjoy it. But I kind of reached the stage now where I've done all the big hits. So I've bought Abbey Road and Revolver, and now I'm slightly moving on to the Star Club Hamburg 1962 Shaved Fish, or the Shaved Fish of Rivers. So. So they're not quite as good, but as with everything, there's still riches to be found, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you're tired of London, you're tired, etc. We traditionally finish these chats by asking people to tell us what's the greatest record ever made. I'm guessing in your case it might be a Beatles record. It may not be. Would you like to venture a suggestion?
Yeah, it is a Beatles.
Have
record.
we put you on the spot here? It
is a Beatles record. I'm very tempted to say Revolver, but I know that everyone says Revolver. I know it's now canonical that Revolver is the greatest, but that was the only album that my parents had.
Right.
And I can, among the records in the attic, that kind of very tattered album.
Right.
Taken
well, if you're going to
record so many times, so I think I would go for that. I'm really sorry for being so conventional.
No, that's
but it's I Revolver. I'm really sorry, guys.
No need to apologise.
You don't need to apologise at all.
David and I, if this doesn't sound too tragic, we kind of talk about this all the time. Could it be Abbey Road? Could it be, With the Beatles?
Well,
Hard Day's Night is the one that.
Well, Hard Day's Night is current favourite, actually. Hard
Day's Night is great. It's great. I mean, they're all great. Of course, they're great, but great with a capital G, I think, is Revolver. I think Hard Day's Night is great lowercase. Revolver is great uppercase. But
so what's the key track on Revolver for you?
I think Good Day Sunshine.
Right.
Yeah,
I think
fantastic.
Because it's about joy.
Yeah.
And I think joy is the hard in any art form is the hardest thing to convey.
Definitely.
And I think the Beatles are great because they found it effortless to convey joy. And ultimately, that's why I prefer, at the moment, I think the early stuff. I think,
Tom, it's been lovely talking to you. That's a terrific way to finish, isn't it, Mark?
It is absolutely. We're off with a spring in our step.
Absolutely. We're all off to play Good Day Sunshine and just dreaming of April or March or whatever it is. Tom, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. Have you got your book there? You can wave to the camera.
Yeah, so I brought two childhood memories that I do still have with me is, of course, Shout. Came out just after John Lennon's murder. And then we've been talking about
very
lists.
pro-Lennon too, isn't it?
Yeah, very. And then the Book of Rock Lists.
Yes.
Which I think I got in 1981, perhaps. Incredibly well thumbed, absolutely full of questions like what is the greatest album? What's the greatest album cover? What's the greatest rock and roll suicide? All that kind of stuff. And I haven't looked at this, I should think, in about 30 years. So inspired by this conversation, I'm going to go and read it.
I've got 3 copies of that book in various different states of tatters. And the reason I had them is we always used to have them in the office when Mark and I worked in magazines. Smash Hits and
it was the big
whatever.
reference, wasn't it?
Because before the internet, that's what it was. If you wanted to be reminded of a bunch of great quartets or quintets or whatever, it would have a list in there.
Yeah, but I remember
nowadays, just go on Google and it's there, you know.
Well, I remember getting that pretty much at the same time as I started getting Smash Hits. And having to kind of basically keep Smash Hits so that I could kind of integrate it into this, because obviously, you know, Culture Club or Adam and the Ants weren't included in this. So, so it's good to know that you were aware of the fact that you were writing the sequel.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Well, look, thank you very much for your time.
Brilliant to talk to you. That was fun.
Word in Your Attic, a Zoom with a View.